Chapter number 2, The Making of Nipsey Hussle and the Ghetto Economic Tract. Nipsey Hussle was a proud member of the Rolling 60s Neighborhood Crips, which is a street organization based in Los Angeles, California, according to Wikipedia. The Rolling 60s was originally formed in Los Angeles in 1976 from the West Side Crips and has since spread to other cities in the United States. Membership is estimated to be between 6,000 to 8,000 people, making it one of the largest street organizations in the Los Angeles area. In many instances, when living in the inner city, joining a street organization is a necessity and not something done by choice. The conditions in which the inner cities have been forced into require a structure and a code in order for its residents to survive. These conditions can be dated all the way back to the beginning of the formation of America and have always existed for economic benefit of one group, the wealthy. Racism is and has always been an economic and political strategy. Those who historically had wealth and power knew that the power of the people will always be stronger than the people in power if the people knew their power. This is why for centuries and even today, wealthy people in power did and do their best to divide in order to conquer. They strategically make us focus on our differences instead of our similarities in order to make us choose a side that is conducive to their continual reign of power and wealth. The book, American Slavery, American Freedom by historian Edmund Morgan, does a great job of proving this fact. What starts off as a history lesson on conflicts between the British, Spanish, French, and English turns into an understanding of why the mass genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of black and white people occurred. Motivated by intense rivalry between England and Spain, the English wanted to free the Indians who were being oppressed by ruthless Spanish conquistadors. To the English, freedom meant something different, and they thought that by colonializing North America, the Indians would be appreciative and submissive since they were no longer under Spanish rule. As explained by Mr. Morgan, English-style freedom was naive. It was arrogant and ethnocentric, which means evaluating other peoples and cultures according to the standards of one's own culture. This arrogance and ethnocentrism infuriated the English settlers and explained why they killed Indian men, women, and children and destroyed their cornfields, even though the settlers needed corn to survive. This level of hatred towards the Indians for their lack of appreciation of their freedom wasn't really freedom since they were still being colonialized and controlled. You think. Okay? It is what the English settlers would use as the reason to begin racist practices that benefited the rich minority. As tobacco became the major product that brought in riches for American planters, they needed to ramp up production to meet the demand. Planters would literally and figuratively work their labors to death. And as the need for more laborers to work new land became vital, land that was stolen once the old land was plagued with weed. Now I wonder where them weeds came from. Was it a drought? Was it a man-made drought? What caused this weed scenario? The desperation for a new workforce grew. Okay, I wonder who that would be. The conditions of the laborers got worse and worse, which led to many of them complaining that they were being bought and sold like slaves. In 1622, Powhatan Indians attacked English settlement, which made it clear that the English and the Indians would not peacefully coexist in the conditions in which the English placed the Indians. As the tobacco trade began to become a global commodity, the class divide between the rich and the poor started to become obvious. Because there was a shortage of white women, many wealthy widows held the power in creating the class separation. They were very particular about who they would marry, so the rich stayed rich and the poor stayed poor. Many young single poor and white laborers who were also male servants had a very slim chance of marrying up, hence solidifying their economic and social status. This is where things began to take a turn. As the English settlers began to fix their labor issues with slaves from Africa, the conditions that both white laborers and black slaves faced were almost identical. Mr. Morgan explained that before 1660, white servants and black slaves suffered similar oppressive working conditions and began to form a unified front. No, we can't have that. They ate and slept together. They attempted to run away together and even began to have sexual relations together. In reality, there wasn't a real difference between how the wealthy treated enslaved Africans and how they treated the white working poor. The poor was the majority, and if they continued to work together, they could have eventually turned the tides, which was dangerous for those in power. This is not to say there weren't racist prejudices that exist, but before 1660, it was difficult to distinguish the difference between racial prejudice and class prejudice, known now today as classism. The lack of distinction threatened to shake the foundation of the new world that the English settlers were creating. The answer to the problem, obvious, if unspoken and only gradually recognized, was racism. Mr. Morgan states, to separate dangerous free whites from dangerous slave blacks by a screen of racial contempt. Because racial hatred towards the Indians already existed, the English settlers did not have a hard time separating and creating content for enslaved Africans and the children of interracial unions. To accomplish this, the settlers were able to give the government to create legal codes that were disguised as a way to protect their slave property and prevent rebellion, but also to reduce the confusion about what was possible for whites and what was possible for blacks. Giving poor whites hope and a leg up made them feel superior to blacks, even though they had currently suffered the same. Racism became a tool that was used to achieve political and economic gain. In essence, racism allowed white men across the class divide to perceive a common identity, which in turn allowed the wealthy to maintain control. Fast forward to post-slavery and even post-Civil War. We'll see the same type of government sanctioned legal codes that were meant to divide and maintain control, but also steal and maintain wealth. Let me repeat. Fast forward to post-slavery and even post-Civil War, we will see the same type of government-sanctioned legal codes that were meant to divide and maintain control, but also steal and maintain wealth. So, according to the Treasury Department, between 1865 and 1874, newly freed slaves saved more than $57 million in the Freedmen Banks, which was a bank founded by President Abraham Lincoln. After emancipation, to help newly freed slaves and African American soldiers integrate into the nation's economy at the end of the Civil War. The bank was headquartered in Washington, D.C., and had branches in 37 cities and 17 states, with the majority of the branches located in the South. It is said that over 480,000 African American institutions used the bank's services, including OG abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who briefly served as its president. Frederick Douglass himself invested $10,000 of his own money into the bank, which would equal $20 million in today's economy. Okay? Do y'all understand? I need you to understand. All right? A series of risky investments caused the bank to go into debt, but it was the decision to build a new building in Washington, D.C. that ultimately took the bank under. It is reported that deposits were taken to build the new building in D.C. and they were never reimbursed. Oh, just like we haven't been reimbursed for the segregation, or we don't have reparations for slavery. They didn't get reimbursed for the money that they had put into the bank. But it was 37 banks across 17 states. So even if one building was a cause of some of the debt, you tell me those other 16 buildings, where did that money go? Okay, where did the money go? That's $1 billion question. Yes, where did the money go? Okay, so many scholars believe that the Freedmen's Bank's failure and the theft of all their savings, repeat, the theft of all their savings, led to a distrust. You think. Do you really think? Okay, yes, you wouldn't trust anybody. That's why the African Americans, the elders, put their money, most likely the reason they put their money in mattresses and safes and in their home. Okay? All of the banking institutions for several generations among the black community. There were attempts to hold those responsible for the thievery accountable, but nothing ever occurred. Specifically, a congressional investigation called for the indictment of several individuals, but that was ignored. Congress even established a program to reimburse depositors up to 62% of their savings, but many depositors never received a dime. You think, okay. Nope. At this point, racism was profitable on so many levels, as you will see by the continual legal and most times overlooked economic injustices. The creation of the ghettos, let me repeat, the creations of the ghettos and the condition in which we find them are of no mistake. It is important to note that despite it all, black people continue to thrive and overcome time after time after time. Yes, we are some resilient people. Case in point, The Great Migration, which occurred between 1916 and 1970, was a time where the economy started to boom in other parts of the country, especially in the North. It is said that prior to the Great Migration, 90% of Black lives in the South. Because of this economic boom, more than 6 million Blacks left the South in search of a better life. However, what it isn't talked about is that most Blacks were fleeing due to acts of domestic terrorism. Let me repeat. They were fleeing due to acts of domestic terrorism, such as lynching and other forms of disparaging brutality at the hands of KKK, law enforcement, and racist white Americans. During this restart, many Blacks had to abandon millions of acres of the most lucrative land in the U.S. Let me repeat once again. During this restart, many Blacks had to abandon millions of acres of some of the most lucrative land in the U.S., which ultimately fell in the hands of their oppressor. Still I rise, Maya Angelou's voice. After the migration tapered, legal segregation, government policies, and racism created what we call ghettos. These factors made it nearly impossible for Blacks to live in any other neighborhood. The Great Migration was a result of white laborers from the North starting to create unions to force better working conditions, similar to what the American planter did during slavery. Wealthy business owners wanted to find free or cheap way to gain labor. Enter the Blacks. To combat against paying laborers who were part of the unions, factory owners started to proactively recruit Black male laborers from the South. Because white supremacy was at full swing by this time, factory owners knew that by hiring Black men, they didn't have to worry about Blacks and whites getting together to demand higher wages. Racism not only made the factory owners more wealthy, but it also made sure that the power of the people would never materialize. The white laborers saw that migration of Blacks as a direct threat to their livelihood. So as a result, we begin to see racial violence in neighborhoods and at work. White supremacists were under the impression that simply touching a Black body would lead to disease. You gotta be kidding me. White supremacists were under the impression that simply touching a Black body would lead to a disease, so they defended their neighborhoods by all means. Excuse. You can make so many excuses in this world for your behavior and your character, but deep down, your behavior and your character is who you truly are. Okay, you do not need to make an excuse. Just show up how you need to show up. Okay, and if you're evil, just be evil. Don't make an excuse for it. That's just me, Alonda Louis Kyriacou, putting her input. If Blacks wanted to live in peace, they had to make a decision to live in worse neighborhoods and also work for less money than their white counterparts for doing the same job. To add insult to injury, the government intervened to create racist policies that would ensure colored lines were not crossed. Some examples of these policies included the provision that allowed homeowners to ensure that their property would never be sold to anyone other than whites for the certain period of time. This was literally written into their property deeds. Even though the Supreme Court found these policies illegal, many local cities and states continue to practice these provisions with no repercussions. Okay, no big deal. They don't want us in their neighborhood, so we'll build our own. said the black trailblazers from Tulsa, Oklahoma, who created Black Wall Street, which was also known as the wealthiest black community in America. Definitely one of. Black Wall Street was said to have had 600 businesses, 21 churches, 21 restaurants, 30 grocery stores, 2 movie theaters, 6 private airplanes, plus a hospital, a bank, a post office, schools, libraries, law enforcement, and even bus system. This was all destroyed during the Tulsa race riot for the Greenwood Massacre of 1921, when mobs of white people attacked black residents and businesses in Black Wall Street. It has been called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. One of. So where were the cops, you ask? Where was the cops, you ask? Let me repeat that. Where was the cops, you ask? Let's repeat. Where was the cops, you ask? By day, they are working citizens. Yes, they are citizens by day. By night. Oh, I think those are the racists coming out. What do you think? What do you think, people? Yes, yes, yes. Okay. You better understand what America we in, okay? As my uncle says, America, Amerikakka. What American are you in? Okay. Are you in the one that doesn't see color, or do you see color? Do you see character, or do you not see character? Let me know. According to many eyewitnesses' accounts, law enforcement supported the attacks against the Black Wall Street residents. It is said that law enforcement officials had refused to stop the organized white mobs and even encouraged white residents to throw flamethrowers at the black residents. It is also reported that local Tulsa chapter of the National Guards had begun to send aircrafts over Black Wall Street and use this advantage to rain bullets on the homes of the black residents. Let me repeat. It is also reported that the local Tulsa chapter of the National Guards had begun sending aircrafts over Black Wall Street and used this advantage to rain bullets on the homes of black residents. This wasn't just an isolated incident. No. The deliberate efforts to keep blacks as an underclass wasn't a conspiracy theory, but in fact, a well-documented pursuit. We can turn to federally backed home loans that strategically kept black families out of the wealth-building process. Starting in 1930s, for the next few decades, the government underwrote home loans that essentially created what we know as the suburbs, and essentially made many of the American households into homeowners. These loans, though, were not distributed fairly, and in essence pushed white home ownership while blacks had to live in the inner cities. The Federal Home Owners Loans Corporation, FHOLC, was created as part of President Roosevelt's New Deal to distribute loans, and part of the process was to create maps that assess the risk and reward of said loans. One of the key components in assessing the risk of the home loan was race. Both the race of the applicant and the racial composition of the neighborhoods was taken into consideration. Black neighborhoods was coded red in these maps and denied home loans because homeowners were deemed to be too risky to take a bet for government guaranteed funds. This practice is what we know as redlining. For decades to come, many other government loan programs used the same reasoning. Then it trickled over to private lending, and insurance companies also followed suit. As written into policy, being black was officially a financial risk. What these policies essentially did was make it nearly impossible for black families to leave the inner cities or to build any wealth. It was also made very easy for white families to become homeowners and began to build generational wealth through home ownership. Even whites who weren't racist benefited from these policies. It made great financial sense for them to take advantage of this new social restructuring. At the same time, while these government-sanctioned racial policies were being enforced, the banks were making it easier for people to become homeowners. This is because prior to the New Deal, home loans had a shorter term of 10 years or less, which meant higher mortgage payments and excluded many working families from being able to afford to buy a home. With the introduction of a 30-year mortgage that also came with a small down payment, home ownership began a reality for many in America, specifically white Americans. This was a significant time as it relates to wealth gap because prior to this working class, white Americans did not have a clear path to wealth accumulation, but now they did. Their homes became an asset that could be passed down from generation to generation. This is why I said earlier that blacks were forced into ghettos. It wasn't hyperbole, meaning I was not exaggerating for effects that were laws in place that created the inner cities. I know that was a long history lesson, but it is important to know if we truly want to understand what Nipsey Hussle was doing was so imperative towards the fight for economic equality. But let's sum it up. So far, you have stolen labor utilized through a system called slavery. Let's repeat that. So far, you have stolen labor utilized through a system called slavery. Turned into domestic terrorism during the Reconstruction and Jim Crow laws that stripped wealth from formerly enslaved people. Then an economic boom for all people in America occurs, but laws were put into place to exclude the people who actually built the country. Because of violence and unfair wage practices, the jobs that these people can get were not sufficient enough to help them live a decent life. Stuck, frustrated, and persecuted by the government and law enforcement, rebellion starts to ensue, and we are introduced to the urban uprising. This was a period of riots in the inner cities against the establishment. It forced many in the inner city to only trust themselves and those within their communities. This birthed the Black Freedom Movement, as explained by Stanford University, was the series of black protests that began with the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and 1956 through 1956. It became the most significant social movement of the 20th century. The history books and many prominent national black organizations mainly stressed civil rights goals, but most of the local institutions were seeking economic and political reform. The Black Freedom Movement was characterized by unconventional and increasingly militant tactics, locally initiated protest activity, decentralized control, and an increased sense of racial consciousness among participants. This birthed the Black Panther Party and their 10-point program, and eventually birthed the Crips, from which some accounts was started by Stanley Tukey Williams and Raymond Washington, both high schoolers in Los Angeles. Reports state that the Crips were founded in 1971 for protection from gang violence. Other claims that Washington, inspired by the Black Panther, formed a political group in 1969 that evolved into the Crips. Either way, there was no denying the rivalry that existed in the streets that led to bloodshed, death, and incarceration. Add to the introduction of crack cocaine into the mix, then you have a dangerous combination that devastated an already fragile African American community. The introduction of crack caused the increase of addiction, death, and drug-related crimes. I can easily start talking about the CIA involvement in cocaine trafficking and how the drugs even got into black neighborhoods, as well as the fact at the same time drugs were being placed in the ghettos to fund a war overseas. The United States declared war on drugs here on our own turf. Again, all of this may sound conspiratorial, but according to Wikipedia, a 1986 investigation by the subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relationship Committee found that the Contra drug links included, among other connections, payments to drug traffickers by the U.S. State Department of funds authorized by the Congress for humanitarian assistance to the Contras. In some cases, after the traffickers had been indicted by federal law enforcement agency on drug charges, and others while traffickers were under active investigation by these same agencies. This draws a clear connection. I could also talk about this war on drugs that seem to be in place in the ghettos, but at the very entity that are fighting against it, created this narrative about African Americans that ultimately led to mass incarceration and how that became a tool for slavery by another name, thanks to the 13th Amendment. Let me repeat that last statement. Okay? Let me repeat. So I got to go all the way up. I could also talk about this war on drugs that seem to be placed in the ghettos by the very entities that are fighting against it, created this narrative about African Americans that ultimately led to the mass incarceration and how that became a tool for slavery by another name, thanks to the 13th Amendment. Would you like to know what that name may be? Okay, well, you know me. I add my unsolicited advice to this first audio book that I'm doing, The Hustle Economics by Ash Cash. Please share, please like it, and please subscribe. Also, buy this gift for your loved ones. This is a must-have. This is a must-read. This will help you in so many ways. Leave a legacy for your family. This opens the conversations that many of us need to have. All right? So, the mass incarceration that started, and another name for slavery is prisons system. Okay? Free labor or cheap labor. Okay? That is your jails. That is your prisons. That is your encampment camps. That is any housing of people that supposedly did a crime. Okay, at one time it was innocent until proven guilty. Now it is guilty until proven innocent. Okay, but that's me. That's my opinion. Okay, that's just me. Alonda Louis Kyriacou. Okay, get this book, Hustle Economics by Ash Cash. Yes, yes, yes. You better get it. You better get it. Yes. The ghetto is a trap. Let me repeat that. The ghetto is a trap, literally. And Nipsey would learn this early. While still a young adult, as a proud member of the Rolling 60s Crips, Nipsey was very transparent about his role in the gang life. From violence to drug dealing, it was very apparent that Nipsey would really live that life. Nipsey's mother was an African American with the roots that trace back to Louisiana, while his father was from a small country in East Africa called Eritrea. When Nipsey was 19, he took some of the money he earned from hustling and bought a plane ticket to his father's homeland. This trip would change Nipsey's life and whole perspective and trajectory of his life forever. Before the trip, he was just a young man from Los Angeles who was knee-deep into the gang culture and with the hopes of beating the trap by becoming a rapper. After the trip, he became a Grammy Award-nominated musician, music executive, an activist, serial entrepreneur, marketing expert, and real estate investor who was committed to changing his community for the better. Nipsey stayed in Eritrea for 3 months, and while he was there, he made some very meaningful connections, but most importantly, he was able to, for the first time in his life, see a place where the people who were in charge were all melanated people and looked like him. Image is a powerful thing. When you see people that look just like you, and they are surviving, and they are thriving, and they are leveling up, and they are doing their work, please believe image is everything. Okay, when he went back home and saw melanated people that looked just like him, it opened his mind. Okay, we need to start taking the truth from melanated people and really considering the truth and using the truth and using the information. It doesn't have to come from any other culture for you to believe. Okay, that's just me talking. Miss Opinionated, Alonda Louis Kyriacou. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, "The mind, once stretched by a new idea, can never return to its original dimensions." That's exactly what happened to Nipsey. Once he got back to LA, his mind was open to the possibilities of how things could be. At one point, South LA in the Crenshaw district was his whole world. Now the world seemed bigger. In a 2010 Complex magazine interview, Nipsey said, "If you don't know your full throttle history, the whole story of how you came to where you are, is kind of hard to put things together. Going to Eritrea filled in the blanks for me as far as understanding myself." Let's analyze this. His trip to Eritrea motivated him in ways that really nothing else could, because it instilled a sense of pride and reconnection to his roots. Let me repeat. Let's analyze this. His trip to Eritrea motivated him in ways that really nothing else could, because it instilled a sense of pride and reconnection to his roots. This is an element of our culture that we have lost, that was stolen, that we were forcefully removed from. At no fault of our own, it was certainly strategically done. However, in Nipsey's death, we must acknowledge that it is time to relearn who we really are and recognize our genetic divinity. Later, you will see that Nipsey's mom encouraged us to go back to our roots and find our creator and spiritual power. Repeat. Nipsey's mom encouraged us to go back to our roots and find our creator and spiritual power. She was simply referring to our true culture and the spirituality of Africa, not to be confused with religion. Repeat, not to be confused with religion. African spirituality simply acknowledges that African beliefs and practices touches on and inform every facet of human life. For example, sickness of the ingenious African worldwide view is not only an imbalance of the body, but also an imbalance in your social life, which can be linked to the breakdown in family relations and, most importantly, your relationship with your ancestors. Having a greater understanding of the power, your connections to your ancestors, the earth, and universal law is empowering and deeply embedded in African American culture. I encourage you to learn more through researching the foundations of African religion, such as Yoruba, Cuban Santeria, Brazilian Cambodo, and Haitian Voodoo. With this new knowledge of self, tapping into his roots, and the idea that a community can be run by its residents, similar to many communities in Eritrea, Nipsey decided to create a long-term strategy that we now know as the marathon. This strategy would be run with his brothers, friends, family, and strategic partners. In the next 2 chapters, we will dive deep into Nipsey's strategy and give you a guide on how you can use it to run your own marathon. Once again, like I said, share, purchase, gift this book. This is a great book. This book is called Hustle Economics by Ash Cash. This is my 81st or 82nd book that I have read within 2 years. Okay? Please do your job. Do your job. Sharing is caring. Love, love, love. Yes. Awesome.